Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Home ARP and Project Homekey Overview webinar. My name is Kayla Thompson, and I am going to spend a couple of moments going over some tech notes, and then we will get into the content that we have for today. So a couple of housekeeping reminders. First, please note that we will be recording the webinar today. If you have any issues with audio during the webinar, we encourage you to switch over from computer to phone audio by selecting the down caret next to the audio button at the bottom of your screen and selecting the option to switch audio. You will then be able to have WebEx call your phone or call in to the webinar. Everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar, but we absolutely anticipate and hope to hear from you through the chat feature in WebEx. To find the chat, please take a look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where you should see the word chat next to a message bubble icon. Click on that to open the chat panel. Please send all questions, comments, and feedback into the chat. When you are sending those messages, please do take a moment to make sure that the to bar is set to everyone. That will ensure that all participants, as well as panelists and presenters, can see those messages. Please note that messages sent to all attendees will not be seen by the panelists. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Karen de Blasio from HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs to get us started.
Thank you, Kayla. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen de Blasio. I'm the Division Director in the SNAPS office. I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar on Home American Rescue Plan, or Home ARP. I'd like to kick us off just by saying thank you for everybody for taking the time to be on today's webinar to learn more about this program and hear from our community presenter. And I really also want to take some time to thank you all on behalf of myself and everybody in the SNAPS office and at HUD for all of the really hard work that you all have been doing over the last year to serve people experiencing homelessness in your communities. As we know, this has been an unprecedented year, and the lift that you all are doing in communities we recognize, and we just greatly appreciate all that you're doing to help serve our clients. So thank you all for that. We're really excited to be here today to talk to you about Home ARP. We're excited about the program and the partnerships that are helping for us to create and help you to create. And we're really excited about this, again, another influx of resources in our communities to help people experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. I'd like to just take a minute and, again, kind of refresh you guys and go over the purpose of the webinar and go over the agenda and let you know who you will be hearing from today. Again, the purpose is to provide you all with a little bit more information on the new Home ARP resource. We have a presenter, Tara Reed from Apt Associates. She will be doing some slides and talking to you all about how to plan in your communities with a focus or a lens on equity. We also have Jenny Sardone from the Office of Affordable Housing Programs. She is going to talk to you all about Home ARP, give you an idea of what's eligible under that program and kind of what the intent of that program is and those resources are. And then we also are very excited to have Jeffrey Ross from California Department of Housing and Community Development to present to you all on Homekey. It's a really great, they're doing some amazing work out there, so we're really happy that he's able to join us to let you all know what they're doing. And then at the end, we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'll be facilitating a Q&A at the end. We expect to have at least 20 minutes. We encourage you guys to put your questions as you kind of get them as they pop into your head while people are speaking and presenting. Put your questions in the chat. We're tracking them, and we will try to answer in the chat, but we will also be I'll be facilitating some at the end, and you'll hear from our speakers and some of our HUD staff to answer the questions. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and get us started and hand it over to Tara Reed from Apt Associates.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon your time zone. As was just shared, my name is Tara Reed, and I am a technical assistance provider for HUD. And so before we provide a program overview of the Home ARP resources, we will first be reviewing ways to approach system planning strategically while leading with equity so as to intentionally close any existing gaps within our homeless response systems and avoid creating additional disparities. Next slide, please. there are disparities within our homeless response system. Black, Indigenous, people of color are overrepresented amongst individuals experiencing homelessness. Black people are 13% of the population and 40% of those experiencing homelessness. Latinx identified people are 18% of the population, but 23% of those experiencing homelessness. Native people are 1.3% of the population, but up to 10% of those experiencing homelessness in certain states. We also can't forget about intersectionality as we look at these numbers and as we think about disparities. Studies have shown that individuals who are a part of the LGBTQ community are more likely to be homeless than individuals who are not. In addition, once homeless, individuals who identify as a part of the LGBTQ community often have their experiences of homelessness extended as a result of discrimination, harassment, and bias. Although this is what we see when looking at data on a national level, we also know that in some communities, the disparities between different groups are even more stark. We are seeing gaps in access, longer lengths of time to be housed, and higher rates of returns to homelessness. These are not individual or personal failures. This is across the systems, and it will take intentional and strategic planning with equity to address. Next slide, please. Please take a moment. You should all hopefully see in the chat a link to Menti, where we would like to hear your thoughts once you kind of click on that link on what you think has led to the disparities within our homeless response system. I'd like to give everyone approximately 30 seconds to kind of click on that link and enter your thoughts. And also, in addition to Menti, I see where some are also putting your answers in the chat. Thank you for that. I'll read it aloud for those who can't see it. I see language barriers, lack of opportunities, and so lack of access to opportunities, also racial injustice, not enough affordable housing. Kayla, do you mind if we pull up the Menti link as well? I also see racism, prejudice, stigma and bias. Do you mind if we share people's responses? I'd like to see what we have up there. Institutional racism, racist policies, lack of political priority, unequal distribution of resources, lack of financial education, funding, not having help to apply, not having the resources to be successful. I see where someone posted that limited funding just for the program itself, and so it ends up with multiple responsibilities on one person, and it's hard to meet all of the needs. I'm kind of reading someone into that response. Access points, locations of available services, that's very true. Just how do people actually enter our system if there aren't opportunities for access? Racial barriers in housing, mental health, criminal justice, resources, addiction recovery, public policy, nonprofits not working together towards a common goal. I see a lot of great answers here. And so thank you to everyone for participating. Please continue to put your responses in that chat as well, but I will also slide to our next slide, if that's okay, Kayla, where we'll also kind of do a high level. It'd be the very next, this one right here. Just with regard to the root causes for disparities. And so as was shared during your responses, the reasons for the disparities, although there were a lot of different responses and they were all quite varied, they're often rooted in structural and institutional racism. And so these are things that we see just our justice system, child welfare, where there's disproportionate involvement and enforcement by the child welfare and justice system with certain populations. We see it within our education and employment systems. Women in the U.S. Are typically paid 82 cents for every dollar paid to male counterparts. For women who identify as Black or African American, that drops to 63%. For Latinas, it's 55 cents. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, 63. Native American women, it drops to 60 cents. Looking at kind of the funding, someone mentioned the funding distribution, we do see inequities within how much funding different schools receive and the supports that are available to students, most often in communities that are predominantly communities of color. We also see disparities within our healthcare system, so obstacles to health that link back to sometimes discrimination and its consequences, historical acts and practices, which have significantly impacted trust in some communities. And then we also have a very storied history with housing itself, just with our history of segregation, redlining, also history of predatory loans and lending practices have all somewhat led us to the conditions that we see today. And so as providers, as system leads, there is a responsibility for us to know about and understand these root causes so as to strategically plan and implement a homeless system response that's led with equity so as to not exacerbate existing gaps and address disparities. Next slide, please. Sorry, I had a bit of a delay on my side. I've mentioned a few times the importance of leading with equity, which should be distinguished from leading with equality. Equality is about sameness. It's focusing on making sure everyone gets the exact same thing. Equity is about fairness. It ensures that each person gets what the person or the population needs to be successful. We know that disparities that already exist in communities are sometimes being exacerbated or made worse by the design of our homeless response systems. I know some people said kind of access. Do we have access in different communities? What are the hours? What are the ways to connect? Is there the appropriate language to provide the connection to people? And so we need our homeless response systems to be centered in equity so as to ensure that everyone, every population gets what they need in order to reduce disparities and be successful. Our supports for individuals experiencing homelessness can no longer ignore existing disparities and try to be one size fits all. To truly achieve equity within our system, our policies and procedures must shift away from prioritizing an equal distribution of resources approach to prioritizing an equitable distribution of resources so as to ensure equitable outcomes for everyone. Next slide, please. Determining how best to lead with equity through strategic approaches requires a system assessment and analysis. The Racial Equity Impact Analysis, or REIA, is a way to examine how different racial ethnic populations could be impacted by proposed funding decisions, partnerships, processes, policies, and programs. A racial equity impact analysis can also be used to reduce system disparities and inequities through the identification and implementation of equitable, centered processes and policies. The 7 components of this analysis are inclusion, data, story behind the data, strategies, impact, evaluation, and lastly, refinement. One thing to note about this process is that although it's a race equity analysis, the process, the steps, can be used more broadly to identify disparities within and amongst all other groups as well. Next slide, please. Hopefully on your screen you see a quote, and this is a quote by Glenn Martin, which says that the closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from resources and power. And so it really speaks to, are the individuals who are most impacted by the decisions that we make at the table? Are those individuals who are closest just because of personal experience to knowing where our system gaps are, where the disparities are coming from? Are they in an influential part of the process? And so Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, those with lived expertise of homelessness, and other marginalized populations should be an intentional, influential part of the teams, identifying where the system barriers are located and informing funding allocation decisions, processes, protocols, partnerships, and policies to address. We need all voices at the decision-making table, but specifically their voices to truly be successful. Next slide, please. So a foundational piece of equity-centered planning is inclusion, and that's creating meaningful partnerships with people with lived expertise, including Black, Indigenous people of color, and other marginalized groups. True inclusion requires respecting and valuing of the voices of individuals at the table for the entirety of the life cycle of the project, showing transparency with your processes, data, next steps, and even ultimate system goals. This means avoiding engagement in power hoarding and gatekeeping of ideas, and instead creating systems with shared decision-making authority. It is acknowledging that the participation of individuals with lived expertise isn't just a transactional relationship or the proverbial checking of a box. The partnerships created should be mutually beneficial with a shared process and mutually agreed upon goals. It is acknowledging that for some with lived expertise of homelessness, sharing their struggles and challenges can be emotionally taxing and requires having plans in place to engage in healing-centered engagement with appropriate supports. It is making sure that meetings are accessible and inclusive. This means everything from providing technology, so laptops and maybe internet hotspots for virtual meetings or cell phones for call-in meetings, being mindful of the times that meetings are scheduled, making sure that any translation provided is culturally appropriate and not just literally translated. It's making sure that you create and hold inclusive spaces for your meetings, which includes the use of preferred pronouns, inclusive bathrooms, and inclusive processes. Lastly, it's making sure that compensation is addressed. Compensate individuals for their time and for the supports that they bring to systems and strategy meetings. Next slide, please. Once you have compiled your team of community stakeholders, people with lived expertise, and partners, review your data and assess the current system's total numbers, components, and participant flow to gain a community-wide understanding of how the system is currently functioning. Then, disaggregate your data or break it down by subpopulations to look for disparities and look for gaps. Look at race, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, household size, disability status, and age. Don't forget to also look at the intersection of the different demographics as well. Once you have completed your data analysis, open up the conversations and ask your partners about what they see and know about the disparities. Map out your homeless system response process from the very first step of someone identifying that they have a need from our homeless response system to all the way through to being successfully housed. And when doing that, identify all of the places where gaps or opportunities for disparities are occurring. Ask the partners at the table, the service providers, the community advocates, stakeholders, and most importantly, the individuals with lived expertise, what they think is happening. Find the story behind the data, while also at the same time being mindful of who has the power in telling the narrative. Are we making this about individuals or are we making it about the system itself? Next slide, please. Once you identify possible causes for differential outcomes within your system, improve your system through strategizing and planning for impact. Use the data assessment analysis as a way to re-envision the system with better outcomes. Plan for what supports can be provided, what changes should be made to fix the disparities through closing the gaps. Set concrete action steps to achieve the desired outcomes with systems of accountability and follow-up. Create infrastructure and sustainability of the new refined processes and strategies through the development of equity-centered policies and procedures that uphold them. Plan to monitor and identify the impacts of change when implemented. This means tracking both the positive and the negative consequences, whether intended or not. This also means continually planning and discussing ways to address disparities. Next slide, please. Engage in continuous evaluation processes when monitoring the system's progress. Plan to learn from mistakes and missteps as they happen and try again. As disparities continue to be identified and as resources keep changing, plan to engage in continuous quality improvement. Plan to refine your partnerships, policies, practices, and funding decisions to address and mitigate new or worsening disparities. With inclusive, meaningful partnerships, using data as a guide, and engaging in strategic planning, we can better use resources to achieve system equity. The implementation of practices and policies may result in an unequal distribution of resources, but will ultimately lead to equitable outcomes for all. Next slide, please. For your review, I've also included as a part of this deck a set of resources from HUD that were released within the past year, and they all address ways to create and infuse equity within your work. Next slide, please. Here we have also included links to communities that have centered race equity in their work. All of these agencies and communities have created task force and initiatives and work plans to address disproportionate overrepresentation of different populations within their homeless response systems. The communities that we are sharing here are Metro Denver Homeless Initiative, Cohio, and LASA, which is the Los Angeles Continuum of Care. I will now transition to Jenny Sardone with the Office of Affordable Housing, who will now present to us all an overview of the Home ARP program.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Jenny Sardone. I wanted to start by just thanking my colleagues in the Office of Special Needs Programs at HUD. First of all, for inviting me or giving me a little bit of time on the webinar to talk about Home Arp today, but also for all the other assistance that they're giving us in sort of designing the Home Arp program. So today I'm going to talk sort of at a very high level about the $5 billion of funding. I'm sorry, slide please. The $5 billion of supplemental home funds that were appropriated under the American Rescue Plan that was passed in March. The purpose of that funding is to assist individuals and households in several qualifying populations that include homeless, at risk of homeless, and other vulnerable populations. Home was chosen as the vehicle for this program because it's primarily a construction program, and that was the intent of the Home Arp funds. So it's, I want to say right at the offset, in terms of what I'm able to say today, and also what we can say in answer to some of the questions that we will inevitably get, that at this point in time, we are quite limited. We can talk about what is in the statute, and what that might mean for participating jurisdictions, for COCs, for homeless providers. But there's a lot of detail that I'm not able to provide today. Until we issue our implementing notice, all of this is pre-decisional, which means I can't disclose it today. So I do apologize for that, and for the inability to answer some of your questions. So the Home Arp funds are intended to provide capital investment in permanent housing for the populations the qualifying populations under the program, and upgrade the available stock of shelter. Also the provision of rental assistance or supportive services. The funds, because these were appropriated under the Home program banner, the funds will be allocated to the 651 participating jurisdictions. Those are states and local governments that qualify for home allocations, using the regular home formula, which is highly targeted to poverty and housing conditions. We announced the allocations. They're on the HUD Exchange website. They came out in April 8th. States, it's difficult to say exactly sort of how much more money they're getting under Home Arp than they get under Home. For local governments, the typical local government is getting a Home Arp allocation of about 3.6 times what their regular home allocation is. Slide, please. So the statute says that the Home Arp funds must primarily benefit what are called qualifying populations. And the statute's pretty specific with respect to most of this. It cites specifically the definition of homeless persons or families in the McKinney Act, the McKinney Act definition of at risk of homelessness, persons who are fleeing, attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, stalking, or human trafficking. And then, and then there's a fourth population called other populations, where supportive services or assistance would prevent the family's homelessness or serve those with the greatest risk of housing instability. And so this population in particular is one where HUD will be exercising its discretion in sort of creating a definition in our implementing notice. And so that's certainly these are vulnerable populations, but it's not quite as easy to sort of look into your crystal balls out there and think about how we might define those populations. So you'll have to wait for the notice, unfortunately. The statute also mentions veterans and families that include a veteran member. that also meet one of the preceding criteria. So as we are implementing the program, we're not treating those veterans as a separate population, since they also have to meet one of the other criteria. Slide, please. There are 4 eligible activities in the Home Arp statute. 2 of them are activities that exist in the regular home program, and 2 of them are things that are entirely new to home. So first of all, tenant-based rental assistance, the development of affordable housing under what we're calling Home Arp rules that will be established in the notice, supportive services, and the statute basically says that supportive services include those under the McKinney-Vento Act, housing counseling. And so think about the housing counseling requirements at 24 CFR Part 5, the sort of the defined term of housing counseling in the HUD regs, and then a sort of an undefined category that, once again, where HUD will exercise discretion of homeless prevention services. And the 4th eligible activity is the acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units. That is probably one of the reasons why I'm here on this webinar about Project Homekey. So you can use these Home Arp funds to acquire, to rehab, or even to newly construct non-congregate shelter units to serve the 4 qualifying populations that are listed in the statute. And those units can remain as non-congregate shelter, or they can be transferred under your emergency shelter grant program. And then finally, it's possible that these units can eventually be converted to permanent housing. And if you look at the statute, that conversion can be to permanent housing under COC or to affordable rental housing, which really means home or Home Arp housing rules. I think it's important, particularly since we're here to talk about Project Homekey, that sort of leasing of this activity will not include leasing of non-congregate shelter. And Congress was quite clear to us that that these funds could not be used for the cost of operating the shelter. And so as you think about how you may want to use or urge your participating jurisdictions to use their Home Arp funds, it's important to keep in mind that there has to be a source of operating for any non-congregate shelter that's created with Home Arp funds. Slide, please. Okay, so as with any HUD program, there has to be administrative funds for the entities that are administering the program. So 15% of the Home Arp allocation can be used for the participating jurisdiction or subrecipient's administrative cost of administering the program. And then I think something that is a really exciting opportunity, particularly for affordable housing providers and homeless providers, is that the statute permits up to 5% of the allocation to pay the operating costs. So think overhead costs of nonprofit organizations that are participating in the program, so a service provider or a nonprofit developer. And so this is sort of a relatively generous source of funds for salaries, insurance, utilities, and so that's very sorely needed. And then on top of that 5%, there's an additional 5% that can be used for capacity building costs. So there's an opportunity here with these Home Arp funds to build capacity and expand the capacity of the existing homeless systems in communities. And so once the notice comes out and you have a better idea of how these funds can be used, I urge everyone to really think about how this one-time funding source can really be used, not just to sort of leave behind sort of capital assets to assist homeless and other vulnerable populations, but also to have improved the system that provides those services. Slide, please. Okay, I think I mentioned, but I'll mention it again. So the Home Arp statute provides us statutory suspension authority and alternative requirement authority for the National Affordable Housing Act. That's the statute that authorizes the home program, and also the McKinney Act. And so we're basically, this is a sort of a home program, but we're basically building a new program from the ground up, because so many of the home statutory requirements really need to be altered or eliminated altogether to serve these populations. And so that is what we're working on right now. We will be implementing the program through a CPD notice to be published this fall. And so participating jurisdictions will be required to develop and submit what we're calling a home ARP allocation plan as a substantial amendment to their 2021 annual action plan. And that'll talk about sort of what their unmet needs are, and and how they intend to use the funds to address them. So at this point in time, we are encouraging participating jurisdictions who are the home grantees to begin talking to the community and to providers across the spectrum about sort of needs and gaps. These plans will not be able to be submitted before the notice is issued, so we wouldn't expect any of the plans to be in until sometime late in the year. But the good news is that these funds are available for expenditure through September 30th, 2030, which gives plenty of time, not just to meet immediate needs in the short term, but also to complete capital construction projects to provide long-term assets in communities. Slide, please. Okay, I want to turn it over to Jeff, because that's the real reason why we're all here today, to learn more about Project Homekey. But before I do, I want to leave you with this URL and ask you, if you've not already done so, to bookmark the Home Arp HUD Exchange page and join the Home Arp listserv. That's where you'll sort of get the earliest possible notification that the notice has been issued, and also get information about the webinars, trainings, tools, and other guidance that we're going to be putting out about the Home Arp program. So please do go to the HUD Exchange, bookmark that page, and sign up, and I will turn it over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Tara, for framing, and thank you everyone for letting me participate and to kind of highlight some of the work we've been doing out in California. Next slide, please. The last 18 months has been a challenge, without a doubt, but that challenge has given us a lot of opportunities to really do some work that was very badly needed within California, and really to get at the heart of trying to solve and prevent homelessness. And so we started as a state shortly after the pandemic to really think about how we can do things differently, how we can move programs, funding, projects at a size and scale and a speed that really addresses the need that was in the moment. We know that obviously with the pandemic, the health considerations, the exposure that folks have if they're unstably housed or have no housing at all, let alone in congregate shelter and things to that nature, really created a situation where we had to be responsive in a way that we had never done it before. And so it really helped us, think about things in a manner and to really not hold to our processes and procedures and things that had kind of built up over time, and really allow for us to also put equity at the heart of what we needed to do. And so that really laid and framed the groundwork that I'm about to go through. Next slide, please. We started back in the early spring, basically with what we called Room Key, which was the most immediate response to the pandemic, and that was a temporary response. And that allowed us to basically house a little over 20,000 people in 15,000 hotel rooms up and down the state. But we knew that that wasn't a permanent solution. It addressed the needs of a segment of our population that was either unhoused, unsheltered, on the street, or that were in congregate shelters that were really not suitable for an airborne virus. And so we knew that, you know, while we had this immediate need and this immediate opportunity to take advantage, obviously the travel and tourism, the hospitality industry took a major reduction of activity as a result of the pandemic starting. And that created the space within the units for us to be able to do this temporary fix. It also created space for us to really think about the permanent solution. How do we take folks that were in these you know, short-term, non-congregate lease facilities and come up with really you know, permanent housing opportunities and do that in a way where we have the units online before these temporary you know, living spaces came offline. And so really it was just a little over a year ago that we began this process, and we launched what became Homekey. And Homekey really was about partnerships, about breaking down silos, about us working in a completely different model than what we had ever done before. And it truly was about bringing new groups, new communities, new populations that we had struggled to bring into the you know, programs over time, bringing them into the system and into the process. It really has been a proof of concept, and in a large part due to we had resources unlike we'd ever had before. So we had $750 million in the coronavirus relief funding that was made available to us to pursue this. We also had $50 million in state general funds and $46 million in philanthropic funding. That $50 million in general fund and that $46 million in philanthropic created the flexibility and the leeway we really needed to be able to make sure that, much to the point that you were hearing with Jenny, the operations component to the physical hard infrastructure, the facilities that we were creating. We used the CRF, the coronavirus relief funds, the $750 million, to really pay for and create the units, and we used that general fund and that philanthropic money to really kind of create the operational supports. What that did is from July of last year to the end of December, I think a lot of folks here will know, the CRF deadline got pushed. We actually expended all the CRF funds the day before that deadline expired, and that allowed us to, within that 6 months' time, bring online 6,000 units that we didn't have before. Next slide, please. And so again, it was a focus, a very conscious design of the program that was focused on permanent housing, but it didn't have to be permanent immediately. We all know that to design and build permanent housing can be done, you know, sometimes very quickly, and sometimes it takes a lot of proactive thought. So we designed a program using these funds, building in the flexibility that really allowed for us to take what were opportunity sites today that could really serve folks in need in the moment, and had a lot of potential to become a real asset to the community and to the service population over the long term. Whenever we engage in this work, we put a 55-year restriction on our projects. So a lot of the sites that we were looking to engage with weren't ready for 55 years in their current form, but again, could be functional today and then become that ultimate project and facility that was absolutely suitable for 5 years. Again, we were focused on equity. We are really proud that we were able to bring in, again, partners that we had not really been able to work with before. We brought in the tribes. We were able to effectively partner with the community college system and provide housing opportunities for you know, emancipated foster youth and TAY that were trying to attempt to go to college. We had farm worker housing. We were able to build LGBTQ housing. So we were really able to kind of cover a broad spectrum over our 94 different projects that we were able to support, and really be able to do that across the state. The targeted geography was really key. We really broke the state down into 8 regions. Because housing is a regional asset, we also wanted to be mindful of making sure that we were accounting for that regional asset aspect to housing, and that we could push these projects, these units throughout the state. It wouldn't be concentrated just in our major metro areas. And so we were really excited to be able to do that. And then this was also really about accessibility. Accessible in terms of the location of these facilities. We didn't want them isolated. We didn't want to create pockets of poverty. We're trying to solve for that. So we really wanted to make sure that they had access to neighborhoods serving amenities, parks, groceries, all the different things that any one of us would want to have access to. Likewise, the on-site accessibility, the physical and auditory improvements that they need. And so these were the core components of how we designed the program. Next slide, please. The model really was, as I said before, a proof of concept. It was about making sure that we can move expeditiously fast, that we can move at a size and scale that we had never done before. We've all been able to successfully do hotel motel conversions, to do vacant parcel developments, to be able to do these things that, on a small scale, 1 or 2 projects at a time. What we were able to do was to do this, again, within a 6-month period, partner with 51 jurisdictions, be able to create 94 distinct projects over 120 different sites in a way that really met the needs of individual communities and individual populations that we were trying to serve. This was not a one-size-fits-all program. This was an umbrella program that really allowed for communities to tailor to their needs. Ultimately, 85% of the housing stock that was created will become permanent housing. And a lot of that, about a third of it, starts off as non-congregate shelter and will transition. We allowed for this transition period to occur. And that also was really important in reducing the barriers and allowing new communities and new partners to participate in the program. Next slide, please. Again, we really tried to break the state down geographically. We knew that capacity was going to be an issue. We created an ambassador program where folks had direct access to HCD staff. We made sure that we had the ability to communicate what we were looking for to our partners even before they applied, and that throughout the application process they had direct access to a very specific team member, so they knew how to get a hold of us, how to ask questions. The team really tried to make sure that we made ourselves available. That was critically important for us to be able to move expeditiously and to build trust and to create the partnerships that we needed to have in place. We also, thanks to the leadership of the governor and the legislature, we were able to really look at land use differently and to expedite and to be able to say, if a project's going to be using these funds and is going to be doing and serving the populations we're seeking to serve, and if this is truly a priority, then what we need to be able to do is say that these projects are conforming under land use, that we can account for the environmental considerations that we need to do. And so the streamlining that came with this program was also incredibly important with how we were able to do this so quickly. And then our philanthropic partners, again, $46 million from Kaiser, from Blue Shield Blue Cross, from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. These funds were instrumental in creating the flexibility and the operational supports that gave our partners confidence to jump in both feet, straight into this program with us. One thing that you will note that in California, it's incredibly expensive to build. Anywhere in the state, it's roughly $380,000 to $570,000 a unit to construct. Wherever we built in California using this model, we saved on average $150,000 to $200,000 a unit. Our average cost per unit for Homekey, and there was a match component in general for this as well. The average Homekey cost was $129,000. That $129,000, we had a 1-for-1 match requirement from our partners. That meant generally on average, every unit also had $29,000 worth of match coming from our local partners. So all said and done, about $160,000 units to construct. So size, speed, land use conformance, and environmental assurance, those types of things allowed us to to really create units at a faster clip and a more economical and cheaper way than what we've traditionally been able to do it. Next slide, please. Again, we couldn't do this without creating trust and doing things dramatically different than what we did before. So that really meant that we had to throw out the playbook and really not be afraid to receive feedback. If something was working great, how can we extend that throughout the state? If something wasn't working, what was the reason? How do we fix it? Could not be afraid to hear both the good and the bad. And so, that allowed us to really build that trust with the local partners, the governor's office, with the 50 plus local agencies and the tribes that we were working with, other sister agencies within the state, continuum of cares, housing authorities, and again, our philanthropic partners. Next slide, please. Ultimately, you've heard me kind of allude to this. This is what we were able to accomplish. The most important thing to think about is within 6 months of the first contracts going out, within 90 days of us executing contracts with folks, projects were being occupied. And that meant, as a result of this, we were able, in our housing, over 8,000 Californians that did not have housing before. And so that was critically important. You, again, can see some of the subpopulations that we're serving. Again, that was 94 projects. We acquired just over 6,000 doors. We occupied and created just under 6,000 units, 51 jurisdictions, 120 unique project sites. Next slide, please. A couple of key examples and why this wasn't one size fits all, but an umbrella to allow for flexibility. The city of Oakland, they were able to receive 3 awards, just over $21 million, 17 different sites, different models within those sites, and different types of units to really get at the different needs of the populations there. The Yurok Indian tribe, 1 award, 18 permanent units for our native partners, and to provide much needed housing. If you remember to an earlier slide, Native Americans on average 10 times the disproportionate impact of homelessness it is on their populations. And then for Riverside Housing Authority, really looking at serving very distinct subpopulations, farm workers, LGBTQ+, youth, and they were very creative in creating some great projects. Next slide, please. Ultimately, this is what a lot of folks were looking at. These projects are functional, and they actually serve as permanent or as affordable housing. I don't want to say permanent, but they serve as affordable housing in their present condition. But they're kind of getting to the end of their useful life. They're marginalized properties. These are great properties that can be reworked into portfolios. These and others, we don't only have to be on hotels and motels. We have the ability. The pandemic is going to push a lot of properties that were kind of reaching that end of useful life, that they were kind of marginalized already. We now need to be creative and think about how to re-engage them, how to reinvest, and how to use those properly to be able to make sure that we can house the folks that we need to house today. Next slide, please. Fresno Housing Authority, they did it on a big scale. They looked at neighborhood transformation, aggregating properties. We worked very closely with them. Again, this was not about creating pockets of poverty, but this was about, this is an opportunity to catalyze and reposition multiple properties and neighborhoods, and to raise up all boats, not just individual boats. And so they proved as a wonderful example and a great partner in trying to do this work. Next slide, please. So we really looked at it as a once-in-a-generation type of opportunity for us to really kind of take some of this work that we've all been doing around the country and to try and do it at a size and scale that hadn't been attempted before. That success, coupled with now this new infusion of Home Arp, we've been looking at CDBG CV dollars to continue this work. Just as part of the budget that is being approved and just got signed into law yesterday. We're excited that a second round of Homekey from state general funds is going to also be able to be leveraged. It's an additional $2 billion that we're going to be deploying in California along with like the Home Arp resources and our federal resources to really continue to go at this. So we are very excited about all of these opportunities, and we know that it's a chance for us to really make a meaningful dent. And two, homelessness is solvable, but it takes resources, it takes determination and tenacity. And that's what we're trying to make sure that we do. And that's the thing that we want to work with all of our partners on, making sure that we listen to ideas, we bring all folks to the table, understand what it's going to take to tackle this. Next slide, please. And so again, with the American Rescue Plan, it's different than the Coronavirus Relief Fund. We know that HUD's going to have slightly different layers on top of it. That's okay. We know that we had to account for NEPA and Davis-Bacon and those aspects of a HUD project. But we can still find really good projects that fit very well, because we're trying to think of all the different ways that we can do this and still be quick. And how do we leverage and braid funding? And so we're going to continue to try and reach out to our partners and invite more voices in, because that ability to communicate, to create trust, to really collaborate is based on the flexibility, it's based on the equity. And then that allows us to come up with the ways of how do we continue to finance these projects, how do we figure out the capitalization, how do we get these to become those 55-year assets for the community and for the individuals that I spoke about. Next slide, please. And so with that, that's where we're at in terms of our thinking. We're super excited to hear what HUD's going to be able to share with us in September, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. As I promised at the beginning, we do have a lot of time left for Q&A, questions and answers. What I think I'll do, just for planning purposes, and Jeff, to give you a bit of a break if you need to get a drink of water or something, we'll save your questions to kind of later in the Q&A. We received a lot of questions while Ginny Sardone was talking. We received a lot of questions on home, some of which we can answer, so we will get to those. There was one in particular that I want to toss over to Lisa Kaufman, one of the SNAP staff members that is on the call. And this was early on while Tara was presenting. Somebody had the question if, based on that presentation, if we were suggesting that prioritizing should be based on race. So I wanted to hand that over to Lisa Kaufman, again, who's in the SNAP's office. She's part of our racial equity team, and want to let her share some insight on that.
Oh, I'm happy to do so. Hi, everyone. Yeah, Tara gave great framing and foundational information for you all as you're thinking about planning and centering equity. And we're all bound by fair housing regulations, right? So we're not allowed to discriminate against any protected class. And we all know that, race and ethnicity are considered protected classes. So we're not suggesting to prioritize by race. What we are suggesting, though, is for you to look at your system, and particularly when we're talking about your prioritization, your assessment systems, to make sure that they are being responsive to the needs of people of color, that you are including organizations that are led by, that are run by people of color, so that you also have them in the pipeline so that they can make referrals and they can make sure to bring in a diverse population to your program. So there's lots of ways that we can center equity and make sure that our systems are more responsive, and that includes training, our training for our staff. It also includes outreach to make sure that you are outreaching to communities that perhaps you haven't outreached to before. And there's also ways to just, make sure that we don't have any sort of barriers in our program that are disenfranchising or have greater impacts on people based on their race. So I hope that question I hope I answered the question. But we in the SNAP's office we have a lot of resources that we've published around equity for our grantees. My colleague April Mitchell Gask is still on the line too, so we're happy to be a resource. You have a great resource in Tara Reid and her work. So feel free to shoot us a question or comment if you need anything further. So I hope I answered that question. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks a lot. I think you did answer the question. And before I start to go through some of the home questions and toss it over to Ginny or to Peter Huber on the phone to answer those, I just want to reiterate, we've answered it several times in chat, but in case people don't see the answer up above, these slides in this presentation will be available on the HUD Exchange. It takes us a couple of days to get everything, compliant and everything, but we will get everything up there. So those of you that are wondering, if you can access the slides at a later date, you absolutely will be able to. So what I'd like to do now is go through some of the the questions on home that were asked in the chat. First, I think, Ginny, you might have touched on this, but there was a question just about the timeline. If there was if you had a timeline for when the implementation notice or guidance might be released.
So yes, I did mention in my presentation at this point in time, we're focusing on the fall. And to a certain extent, it's hard to commit to a specific date because this has to go through OMB and sort of other things have to happen. And so, we are, our hope is that we'll have a notice out in the fall. And if I can just add on to that, sort of to answer a couple of the other questions in the chat, people were asking, since they're related, people were asking, can I have my grant before the notice is out? Well, actually, no, you can't. And the reason for that is that you don't sort of, until that notice comes out, no one actually will know what is an eligible activity or not an eligible activity and what the requirements are for these funds. And so you can't have a grant until you do your Home Arp allocation plan, and you cannot do your Home Arp allocation plan until you know what the requirements of a Home Arp allocation plan are, and you can't know that until sort of we also tell you what the eligible activities are. So I hate to disappoint some folks in there who were hoping to get their grant early, but I think that sort of for planning purposes, I think if we get the notice out, let's say in October, and people can get their allocation plans in possibly by the end of the year, then we may see sort of grants in accounts very, very early in 2022. I think that's probably the most optimistic timeline that we're looking at this point in time. So I think that answered about 3 questions in the chat. So
it did. Thanks. A couple more that have to do with timelines and things. Somebody was asking, well, I'll give you like 2 questions and see if we can knock these out. How long will they have to spend the money, giving consideration to the fact that site control and land use approvals take time, and will pre-award costs be allowed?
So the statute permits the funds to be expended through September 30th of 2030. That's a lot more time, for instance, than was given in the CV appropriations, and it's something that we, we're really adamant about having because these are physical development activities. So the funds will be available till the end of 2030. So that's good news for those who want to sort of build housing with these funds. Pre-award costs, we've been starting to get a lot of questions about that in our sort of Home Arp mailbox. And so we will be putting something out in the near future about how and when pre-award costs can be incurred. So I don't want to commit to answering that question now, but it is something that we're talking about, sort of putting out an FAQ before the notice comes out so that people will understand sort of what the parameters are for that. So please stay tuned and sign up for that Home Arp listserv because we'll announce the publication of that FAQ when it's ready. I do see actually somebody, so if I can also just address some other questions, I'm actually seeing them come up in the chat. We had several questions about CHOTO set-asides. So, or, you know, whether sort of developers had to be CHOTOs, that kind of thing. So I should mention, for those of you who are familiar with the home statute, the regular home statute, there are 4 things that are explicitly suspended, 4 statutory requirements explicitly suspended in the statute. That is the home match requirement, the CHOTO set-aside requirement, so there's no 15% set aside for CHOTOs as in the with a regular home grant. There's no maximum per unit subsidy limit, and there's no commitment deadline. So, and then the other authority that we have is to sort of suspend statutory requirements of home. I also want to mention, I saw a question in the chat. Sorry for doing your job for you, Karen. I just want to make sure I get the sort of the ones that I really want to answer. So I think it's really important. So the one thing that I would really suggest that people do is go to the Home Arp, HUD Exchange page and take a look at the statute. It's only 3 or 4 pages long. It's easy to read. You know, even if you're sort of reading statute is not your typical thing. And it'll give you a sense of sort of what's eligible and what's not eligible. Because, and I think that's, you know, that's really would be helpful to folks. And so there were a couple questions about sort of these qualifying populations versus income. And so even though I'm pretty limited with respect to what I can say, sort of on pre-decisional matters, the statute is really quite clear. The populations that can be served, the individuals or families that can be served are people in those 4 qualifying populations. So unlike the regular home program, there's not going to be income testing per se to make you eligible. What makes you're either eligible because you are in one of those qualifying populations or you are not. And so I think it's sort of helpful there, you know, this is, I like to say this is the home program, but it's not the home program. And there are certain sort of structural things about the home program that the regular home program that will not be a part of this program. And there are some that will be, which is why I think it's so important, as difficult as it is, to be patient. And wait for that notice so that you can see what this program actually looks like. But it's, you know, it's difficult. There's so much discretion that HUD is having to exercise in putting this program together based upon this statute and the existing home statute, that it's really difficult to sort of, you know, predict what we'll do.
Thanks, Jenny. And I don't know if you already answered this. I don't think you did. We had a couple of people ask whether or not the developer had to be a qualified CHOTO. Did you answer that? I apologize.
So the CHOTO requirement is suspended. In the regular home program, there's a 15% set aside for CHOTOs. That's suspended in this statute. So you can have any kind of a developer doing affordable housing development in this program.
Got it. Thank you. Let me see. There's just a couple more Home Arp questions. Can Home Arp be used as capitalized rent subsidy reserve for permanent affordable housing for 10 to 15 years?
Okay, so that is not a question that I can answer. That's, you know, that is something that'll be sort of discussed or not discussed in the notice. So it goes beyond the statute. Sorry, so I can't go there.
Okay.
I did also want to be clear, if I can, you know, there seemed to be a little bit of confusion about operating, and I tried to answer that in the chat. So there's no operating, these funds cannot be used for ongoing operating costs of a shelter. The operating costs that are authorized by the statute are actually the operating costs of nonprofits undertaking activities. So, and one person asked, is it operating money for the COC? No, it's actually operating money for the specific nonprofits that are undertaking home ARP activities. So hopefully that is, hopefully that helps a little bit. Somebody asked whether sort of things like Davis-Bacon would apply. Yes, if you look at the Home Arp statute, you will see a list of things that HUD cannot waive or suspend. And so that would include environmental requirements, labor standards, which is Davis-Bacon. So there's, you know, looking at that statute is a good investment of, you know, 10 or 15 minutes to give you a sense of what things might look like.
Okay, great. Just one or two more questions for you, Jenny. This
Sure.
one, you know, if you can't answer, but somebody wanted to know if they could spend Home Arp funds on housing activities located outside their jurisdiction, but they would benefit homeless, you know, homeless or those at risk of homelessness or LMI.
So I can't answer that specifically today. The thing that I can say is that the home statute permits the use of home funds in contiguous jurisdictions for projects that benefit the sort of the residents of both jurisdictions. And so this is one of the areas where HUD will have to make decisions in its implementing notice to leave that exactly as it is or to change it. I should say in the regular home statute, the projects have to be jointly funded by both jurisdictions. That's what the regular home statute says. We have statutory suspension authority. We will have to decide sort of whether to use it, and if so, how. So stay tuned for that notice.
And I get one last question for you, Jenny. You might see it. It's pretty recent in the chat, but one person was asking if there would be specific guidance for home consortiums.
So the rules for a home consortium are no different because for the purposes of the home program in our statute, a consortium is a sort of single entity, which is why they sign a legal agreement forming a legal entity. And so, you know, there's always some nuances with respect to how consortia operate internally, but from the perspective of HUD, it is sort of, there's no difference between a consortium and a metropolitan city or an urban county. So you won't see guidance specific to consortia, but you'll certainly have, when you have consortia, and some of our consortia are very large, some of them cover very large rural areas, for instance. You know, that is always a more complicated matter sort of internally to sort of prioritize and work together. So no specific guidance, but certainly we recognize the sort of the added challenges of and you know, that sounds like actually a great area for us to do some technical assistance. So I thank the person who asked the question.
All right, and thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
And thanks, Peter, for that. I know you guys have been answering kind of furiously, answering all the questions that you could answer in the chat. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So Jeffrey, your break is over now. We've got some questions for you. So hopefully we've got about 20 minutes left. So I think we should be able to get through most of the questions that we have for you in this time. One, I think we had a couple people in the chat ask, just simply, how could they apply to be part of Homekey and access the funds?
Right. So, you know, and I know there's a similar question about like how Home Arp and Homekey will interact. So, you know, they're very similar programs, but they are distinctly separate. So we are looking, the team at HCD is working on the launch of what we're calling Homekey 2.0, the second round, second tranche, where we have a couple of $1 billion, as I mentioned, to continue this work. And then we are also actively trying to frame in anticipation of all the wonderful news HUD will share with us on the Home ARP program. And to make sure that we, as soon as we can launch both of those programs. And I think there'll be opportunities for some projects to potentially braid funding between them, if that makes sense. because sometimes there's some nuance that folks might do, or it'll be completely separate and different, and that's okay. And we'll continue to work with any of our partners in doing that. Just like the Homekey program had the first time, it had we had an online, type of application process. We'll be looking to make some modifications, improvements to that, but they're, they'll be looking to go online and happen again. And so more news will be being released here shortly along Homekey specifically, and then along the Home Arp allocation. Again, as we get a little bit more details, then we'll be prepared to push out as much information as we can on that and how to try and frame in terms of the projects to come in. And I know that there's been a few questions in the chat about unit size, types of units. I want to say again, this wasn't a one size fits all. So we had micro units up to like 3 and 4 bedroom units. We had single family homes, hotel motel conversions. We had modular construction. We had manufactured homes. We had single family homes. We converted commercial space. We took vacant lots and built on them. We literally did every type of development you could imagine within that 6-month time frame. So the flexibility is there. I think under either Home Arp or Homekey, because the key for us is these have to be permanent, livable places for human habitation. Look, I know there's loaded terms out there. Tiny homes is one that comes up a lot. You can call it whatever you want. We just want it to be a place with electricity, heat and air, plumbing, suitable for human habitation that folks can reside in for a long, long time. So that's the key pieces that we're looking for. That's the way we're looking at program design. And I know that we have other questions, so please feel free to ask those.
Thank you for that. One question about hotel conversion, and was that done by a private developer?
Right. So much like you can imagine with the Home Arp program, and we actually had home in mind when we designed Homekey, we said we needed public entities to be the primary, and what that meant is that they had to be they're the ones that were receiving the funds. They could identify who their development partners were. In many cases, that was private developers, and private developers actually led much of the work on the ground, right? But we wanted to make sure that we had that public entity working with us. And then the reason I'm saying public entity is there's 2 important partnerships I cannot underscore enough. Housing authorities. You need to try and bring your housing authorities along. There's a lot of questions about operating subsidies and ongoing funding for these projects and programs. Your housing authority has great resources in not just the traditional vouchers, but in some of the subpopulations, right? The HUD BASH. Now these new vouchers that are going to be coming out, the quote unquote disappearing vouchers. There's nothing wrong with attaching these disappearing vouchers to households that need support for a long, long time, because it stays with them until they don't need it anymore. So there's nothing wrong with that. I understand that project-based vouchers give you more underwriting leverage on the private banking market, but the HFAs out there and some of our other partners on the quasi-public private side, they're looking to do pilots. They're looking to try and figure out how to support this work, and they can help stretch dollars as well. So bring your housing authorities along. They're huge assets, as are the annual HUD NOFA when it comes to the homeless funding and services support. In California, we have a couple of $1 billion going to our HAP program. That's going to be something that's going to be available to help support some of our stuff specifically in California. But other states have other programs too. And then the other partner I want to say, again, why we say public entity is the tribes. They are a government sovereign entity, and we want to and need to, I cannot underscore, we need to bring everyone along. Everyone needs to have a seat at the table. We started this conversation about equity. It's critical. It can't just be all those that have always participated or that we're used to working with. Quite honestly, just being really frank, if it was working, we wouldn't all be trying to solve homelessness. We have to do stuff differently because we're not there yet. Homelessness is solvable, but we can't be satisfied with what we've been doing. And so that's a critical piece.
Very good point. Yes. One question that I'm actually interested in too, and that somebody asked, and I don't know if you have this yet, but somebody is wondering if there were any statistics at this point with respect to how many room key participants exited the program and then back into being unsheltered. I'm not sure if you guys have that information or, you know, have an idea.
Right.
I thought that was an interesting question.
No, it's a great question, and we know that we're trying. That is very important. We're trying to make sure that we capture that as best as we can, because when we're designing programs for homeless, we know that there is a certain level of dropout in placement, right? So if projects are being designed and hitting the level of need appropriately, then 85% of folks will stick in that project. Some folks fall out because we actually were hitting pretty low in the need category, and so they actually need a little deeper need, right? And so the trick is to catch them and make sure that we move them on to a more appropriate permanent solution. So we are trying to do that. So of course, like everyone else, we try and data mine our HMIS system and make sure that we're coordinating with our COCs to understand where gaps in that are. In California, we just launched the HDIS system, which allows us to take the aggregated information from all of our COCs throughout the state and kind of help inform us from a statewide design and program implementation. So we're very excited about having that launch and using that to begin to start to really help inform. Not all of our room key sites have closed, so there's still more data to be collected, and we're trying to be very mindful that we're trying to make sure that as room key sites close, that we're trying to work with partners up and down the state to try and find those permanent solutions for folks.
Thank you. One other question that's interesting, how did you encourage owners to sell?
So this is where I think that a lot of businesses before the pandemic, as I was trying to allude to, were getting to the end of their useful life. Their current structure, the way that they were operating, they were becoming more marginal in their use, not as positive in cash flow. So we knew that folks see the government coming, especially with some of the numbers I was throwing out there, as a blank check. That was never going to be what we were going to do. We weren't just going to agree to buy whatever someone was selling. Our partners were very methodical. They knew the properties they wanted to go after. They knew the types of properties they were trying to do. Again, they were doing this in partnership with private developers, with nonprofit developers, with housing authorities. They were looking at how do we serve folks best and what properties would do that, and who were the sellers that were really authentic. We walked away from a few projects where sellers tried to give us one thing, and then they did the bait and switch, and we said, no, we're not playing that game. So, there's no reason to think that, yes, we were focused on hotels and motels in the last year. There's still going to be those opportunities going forward. But there's going to be a lot of commercial space that is in very prime real estate that can easily be converted and is ideal for what we're talking about. So again, there's vacant property and stuff like that. So we just have to be creative. We can't be afraid to engage. Again, authentically, partnerships, trying to make sure that we're doing this in a way that we're bringing all folks along. And you're going to have good, willing sellers who they want to do something different. They want to make a little profit, but they also want to see their property go on and be something that can be an asset. So those opportunities are out there.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions about operating costs or operating subsidies. What operating subsidies were used for Homekey units?
So we asked all of our partners to take a leap of faith with us, right? Because we were trying to move so quickly. And we know that under a normal project, we come in, we identify our gap financing, we go after tax credits, we capitalize operating reserves, we do all these different things. And that gets us to 15 to 20-year operation cycles where we recapitalize it, and then we go through our 55-year cycle. We had to move really quickly. And so we said, we needed our partners to identify 5 years of operating subsidy within their control that could be made available to make sure that as we acquire these sites with them, that they could be functional and serve the need today, and then use that 5 years to figure out how to reposition and identify those ongoing permanent operating subsidies. We were fortunate, again, with the general fund and the philanthropic dollars, to be able to provide at least every applicant one operating subsidy grant of up to 2 years. We were successful in providing 67 of the 94 projects, those 2-year operational subsidies. But again, 2 years and 5 years, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of what other funding sources were available. And again, I highlighted earlier the annual NOFA that HUD puts out, because it takes a while to get in line sometimes and to make sure that your project is competitive to go after that source of funding, as well as to line up tax credits and other sources that are out there. And again, in California, we have HAP dollars that are coming through the state budget, but you know, local governments also have access to we have different measures where bonds have been taken out to fund different things in different communities. So again, it's trying to identify all these different sources. In some places have a little bit more resource than others, and trying to create a flexible space for us to problem solve with folks while we're trying to actually serve the population today.
Great, thank you. We have time for a few more questions. Someone asked this good question: were there any green building requirements enforced on the new construction projects?
We actually tried to incentivize that. So we did have, again, when we looked at how do we break the state out in regional, categories, how do we incentivize equity, how do we incentivize durability and stuff. So we had some great green projects that came in because folks were trying to get that little bit of competitive advantage that wasn't going to break the bank in terms of trying to make these projects happen. We built in Silicon Valley a project that had over 100 units that was around $100,000 a unit, right? Like, you don't see those prices elsewhere because, again, folks were thinking of creative partnerships and how to do things differently. So green building was an incentive, something we wanted to make sure that was a part of what we were doing. It's something that the state of California takes very, very seriously. Our partners take very, very seriously. And so, these are things that we're going to be looking at Homekey 2.0. How do we continue to incentivize those things? Because we need to deliver units that are sustainable, both for the broader community and the environment, and they're sustainable for the individuals we're trying to serve.
Great, thank you. Couple of questions about funding. First, someone was asking if Homekey was solely a state-funded program, and if there was somewhere they could see the 6,900 projects that were funded in the first round.
So it's 94 projects, 6,000 units, 8,000 folks housed. And so we did a report to the legislature on April 1st. So I know, links are great, and we can always, sometimes links break. If you just Google Homekey and report, it will come right up. You'll see hcd.gov, and you'll see a report to the legislature, and you'll see that. Likewise, our Homekey site is up on the HCD website. So lots of acronyms I'm throwing at you. I know that. But again, if you just type in Homekey on any search engine, and it will bring you straight to our website where all of this information, the guidelines we put in place, the structure of the application, our report, all that is living there. And then it will be infused with new documents here shortly as Homekey 2.0 begins to launch.
And that was actually one of the questions that somebody just asked: when do you expect Homekey 2.0 NOFA to come out?
I'm going to do my Ginny impersonation, and I'm not going to be able to answer that question at this moment, but please do know that lots of folks will know the moment we can launch it.
Got it. Got it. I think we've answered most of the questions. Let me see. I don't know if you can answer this because it has to do with the next round, but somebody did ask if the next round of Homekey funds will only be available for hotel motel conversion, or will funding be allowed to be used for development of housing on city or county owned land?
Absolutely, on city and county owned land, and that's why I listed that whole array of manufactured and modular and commercial rehab and vacant sites where we built from ground up, and all of that's going to be on the table because, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's we need a little bit of everything, and every community is slightly different on what it needs to serve its actual individuals that are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And so we want the program to be responsive to that need. And I do see that there's a question on NEPA and Davis-Bacon. Again, we know that NEPA and Davis-Bacon were not something that could be waived. So we're just going to be mindful of what projects make the most sense to make sure that we can streamline them as quickly as possible, get them funded and going. So we're going to be looking to work with our partners. We know that we don't want to have to be in a situation where we're funding a project that it's going to take years to get through some permitting and other approvals, right? So we'll be mindful to work with our partners, technical assistance, things like that, to make sure that we're doing that type of work up front. Again, we don't want folks to be guessing. We want to be work partnering. And then I know that there was a question on folks that are either criminally justice involved or behavioral health issues. Absolutely. You know what, when people think of and reach out to us and to the electeds and the folks that are supposed to be solving it, a lot of times those are the folks that they're like, what are you doing to help this population? We are going to be creating projects that serve that population. That is our goal. They're absolutely going to be eligible. We're going to want to understand how best to do that. And again, it's about partnerships and ideas. And look, there's a lot of room for us to grow in this area. We know we can do better. So, you know, bring your ideas, bring your energy. We are happy to engage.
Thank you. Great. I'm going to close us with one final question for you, Jeffrey. And this is with respect to, you did see the question about people exiting incarceration, that special population. So thank you for answering that. We did have a question. They asked if you could share more in regards to the availability for foster youth.
Absolutely. So, you know, I'm incredibly proud that we were able to partner with Imperial College last year and create 20 units with the college and with the city to create a housing environment for foster youth that were exiting and that were trying to go to college. So that was one example, and it was a great partnership. And we want to expand that. We want to get at foster youth. There's an incredibly vulnerable group of folks that just absolutely need our support. We welcome any ideas and partnership and energy. We want to get at these incredibly vulnerable subpopulations because we don't only want to solve homelessness today. We want to start solving it tomorrow, which means we need to cut off people falling into the system. We need to have places for folks to come into without ever having to come into the homeless system. So we need to develop these projects now. We need to have more units. We need to have them sustainable. And so absolutely we want to do that. We're looking for those opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I want to wrap us up again by thanking everybody for taking time to be on this call to learn more about Home ARP and learn about planning with a centering on racial equity and really just, you know, again, get to hear from Jeffrey and what some of the great things they're doing out in California. Thank you to everybody who presented, Tara, Ginny, obviously Jeffrey. Thank you to everybody on the back end that kind of has been frantically answering questions for us and helping us kind of go through all the questions that we were able to answer. I will again state that this webinar and all of the slides will be available on the HUD Exchange. Again, it takes us a couple of days to get everything kind of prepared to be able to post, but give us a couple of days and you should be able to see this. And again, just for those of you out there, thank you for all of the work that you do in your communities to help those experiencing homelessness. And I want to wish everybody a good rest of their day and a good rest of the week. So thank you, everybody.